Okay, so without further ado, we're going to get into our economic panel. And really, Victor, that was a wonderful opening session, I think a historic one, but you've outdone yourself here assembling the smartest economic thinkers in the world, full stop. So thank you very much. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to very, very quickly introduce the panel. Then each of our panelists will give us a brief perspective on what he sees as the big economic issue, the big economic idea. Then we will have a group discussion. And then we're going to end at 12:50 sharp. So here goes. And I'm going to have the panelists speak in alphabetical order because all of you are so important. I could figure out no other way of determining the hierarchy. So very quickly to introduce the panelists, we have Andrei Kostin. He's the president and chairman of VTB Bank, very leading Russian businessman. Next to him is my very dear friend, Martin Wolf, brilliant columnist for the Financial Times. And Martin, please get ready to buy the brilliant book, Martin is Almost Finished, which I hope he'll give us a little bit of a preview of about the world economy. Next to him is our good friend, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, former head of the IMF. Thanks for being here. Next to him, Larry Summers. We're very, very lucky to have a chance to hear from Larry, former Secretary of the Treasury, former president of Harvard, also a wonderful columnist. And next to him, Bob Zoellick, former president of the World Bank, and a great columnist too. These guys are going to put journalists out of business. Okay, so starting with Andrei. Andrei?
Thank you very much. I'll try to quickly address all the major subject which was mentioned in the program. And I would like, first of all, to mention that we today might celebrate two important anniversaries. One is, of course, the 10th, very cheerful anniversary of the Yalta European Strategy Annual Summit or meeting, and the fifth mournful anniversary of the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which took exactly 5 years ago in September 2008. I think the time which passed in that date give us some ground to draw some conclusions, actually, on what's happened between 2008 and 2013. And I would like maybe just to single out a couple of things. First of all, that many expectations which we had in 2008 never fulfilled. I'll start with the one which is close to my heart. This is financial sector. As we all know, the crisis started with the subprime crisis in America, which everybody expected would lead to a substantial downside in the financial sector, which never happened. Actually, the financial sector all around the world is growing, which probably irritates some politicians and officials, but that's fact of life. I mean, the sector is growing in all countries, including the country which it was affected first, United States. The second issue which is mentioned is the model of the global economy. I think we definitely witnesses the changing trend of the model. We are now living in the time of drafting a new model of the market economy, because none of the previously existed models seem to be good enough for present situation. I mean, the US-UK free market system, the EU welfare state system, or even the China model with strong footholds of state-owned big enterprises. The third issue is that we didn't probably expect in 2008, when we spoke about decoupling of crisis and this kind of thing, that the crisis actually would take the stages of rotation. It started with the American economy. It then went to Europe with a deep European integration financial banking crisis. And it seems now that it does affect the emerging market, which 5 years ago we saw as a driving force to actually to compensate the losses which we expected or we had in the developed economies. Another thing which is quite surprisingly, I think, and we never expected before, it was stated during the recent G20 meeting in St. Petersburg that actually the engine for the economy nowadays is not the emerging markets, but actually the developed world. We see the American economy is doing well. We see that the European economy is just about start to grow, but we see a lot of problems accumulated in emerging markets. What we see today, actually, the growth of cost of production in China and other emerging economies, and the consistent level of cost in the United States. And for the first time in many years, we see the movement of the production from Asia back to United States. The question about, very quickly on the question of austerity and stimulus. I think there's not a choice between stimulus and austerity. It's just a saying which side you should drive, left or right. It depends where you'd like to go to. But what we witnessed over the last period of time, that the developed economies actually combined the strict regulatory policy with and the budget policy with a quite lavish and very flexible monetary easing, which led to a substantial inflow of investment in the emerging markets, but also posed a very serious problem for countries like Russia and Ukraine in the near future if the monetary policy would be more stricter. And the final issue, which was mentioned in the papers for the conference about the currencies. I see definitely a lot of potentials for development of regional currencies. And first of all, of course, renminbi. As the growth of the Chinese economy and its role, I would expect that though dollar and euro will stay as a major currency in the world, on the regional level, we can expect currency like yuan or even ruble, probably in the CIS territory, would gain some momentum. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Dominique, you're up next.
Thank you, Christian. Well, global economy season 1. Let's look at the US. Growth is not that bad. Inflation is low, even if real estate prices are picking up, which is good. Unemployment is not that bad, and Fed is considering tapering. China, the other big giant, growth is not as high as before, maybe around 7.58%, not bad. And recent paper in the Financial Times by Lee shows that at the highest level, they do understand the trade-off between growth and rebalancing the economy. Japan, almost everybody is praising Abenomics. And even if you look at the European Union, the sick man of the global economy, eventually no collapse, no exit from the Eurozone. Growth is slightly and slowly picking up, at least in this quarter, and the rate of increase of unemployment is decreasing. And even Ukraine is ready to join. We heard this from both presidents a few minutes ago. Can everyone believe in this tale? Let's turn to Global Economics Season 2. In the US, forget about unemployment. Look at employment. And employment is not growing very fast, not for the least. Fiscal cliff has been a topic a month ago, no more today, but it's still there. And nothing real has been done. And Fed is not tapering. So I'm really worried about what's going to happen there. China is facing huge problems. Not only the one we all know, financial sector, inequalities, flight from the countryside to cities, pollution, but also something which I feel is rather new, which is the lack of power from the center on the periphery. And this takes us back to decades ago, which has always been the case in China's history, with a strong center or a weak center. And I'm afraid we're going into a process of a weak center. Japan, Abenomics are less and less effective, and in a few months won't be effective at all. And the European Union, as I said, unemployment, the rate of increase in employment is decreasing, but growth is obviously too small, too low to create any kind of job. And the focus still on more or less austerity, when the real problem for the European economy, but maybe Germany, is competitiveness. And very little is done to restore this competitiveness. So in a couple of years, it will be really time to buy European companies. That's just an advice I give to our friends who are in the business. On top of that, none of the governance leadership problem in the European Union has been solved. So what Ukraine is ready to join is a fuzzy set of countries. Let's take for a moment Pascal Lamy categorization. He says countries are solid state, they have governments, and unions are liquid state, because you know the links and power links inside are very small. But I think that European Union is not anymore a liquid state, it's going to gaseous state, where in a few months or year, it will be almost impossible to take any decision. Lithuania's president rightly said a few minutes ago that the consensus was needed, which is the right thing for democracy. The problem is that there's no effectiveness with a consensus among 27 countries, and even more tomorrow morning. And then if you turn to emerging countries, India, Indonesia, Turkey, Mexico are fighting to avoid a too sharp decline in their currency. Russia is experiencing new problems. So add to this a total mess in Arabic countries that it seems that very few Westerners understand, and you have what I believe is a perfect storm. So no surprise that the interest rates are on the rise. So my only point this morning is this: globalization is a war, a new kind of war, but a total war. And what I see is that there are very few parts of the world, and certainly not Europe, who are ready to fight.
Okay, you've now completely terrified me, Dominique. Larry, you're known for your sunny, rose-colored glasses perspective on things. Are you going to cheer us up a little bit?
I wish I could. I'd approach it this way, Christia. A central feature of healthy societies and a defining feature of life in the vast majority of what's today the industrialized world for 2 centuries has been the confidence that parents have that their children can expect to live better and more comfortable lives than they did. That idea is today in doubt in much of the industrialized world. In the United States, median real incomes for families have not had a period of sustained increase except for 5 years during the 90s in more than a generation. In Europe, the fraction of young people established into new careers has declined substantially. In Japan, concern about the future is at a point in an aging society where the sale of old age diapers very substantially exceeds the sale of baby diapers. That malaise about the prospects for the future ultimately affects the ability of the center to hold politically. It affects the ability to build a coalition for internationalist policies. It affects the ability to support generous policies towards those who are left behind within countries. And it seems to me it's the defining problem of this age. And it seems to me that it has its roots in economic forces of two kinds. The cyclical malaise that has pervaded the industrial economies since the onset of the financial crisis and looks nearly certain to continue for at least a number of more years, as there has been great difficulty in restoring normal cyclical conditions, a challenge that, in my view, goes heavily to issues of assuring adequate demand and assuring the stability of demand, and demand has fallen too short for too long in too much of the world. But I think it is a grave mistake to suppose that no matter how well demand is managed, that prosperity and better prospects for youth are under control. Technology and globalization, I think technology is the more important of the two, are bringing about profound changes in patterns of growth and in the relative rewards to different elements of society. The ability to do routine work was never very scarce, but it is far less scarce and therefore far less compensated than ever before. And the ability to create something new comes with greater leverage and larger markets than ever before. And those forces are driving widening inequality, which contributes to the pressure on the vast number of young people. This will be the first generation in the United States where the children were not substantially more and better educated than the parents since the founding of the Republic. That goes to economics and slow growth. It is, in important respects, a consequence of slow growth, but it is also a challenge to future growth. So yes, let us by all means manage more aggressively our way out of the cyclical malaise, but let no one be confused into thinking that that is the whole or the largest of the issues that we face.
Okay, you didn't succeed in cheering me up, Larry. Martin, I know that you've been writing and thinking about a lot of the issues that Larry has been discussing just now. What's your take?
First of all, it's a great honor and pleasure to be here in this historic hall. I hadn't realized before I agreed to come how difficult it will be to get here, but the trip has been worthwhile. So thank you very much for inviting me. Second, in response to you, I follow one iron rule, which is that whatever I'm going to say, it's not what Larry said. So I'm not that stupid. So I'm going to say something completely different, but maybe in the discussion we can converge a bit. I'm going to ask you to think about the world economy as a whole rather than the bits. And if you look at the world economy as a whole, you see something which I think is pretty extraordinary, particularly at the moment. And the most important part of it is that if you can think of the developed country central banks in aggregate, they account still for about 60% of the world economy. They are the major central banks of the world. They have been providing free money, absolutely free money, for 5 or 6 years. One of them has been providing absolutely free money for closer to 15 years. And we are incredibly excited about the possibility that one of them, the most important, will stop increasing the amount of money it issues every month by $85 billion, which is seen as possibly the end of the world. I am describing to you a depression world. This is a depression world. If you didn't know anything else about the world economy, you would say a world in which monetary policy has this characteristic is a depression world. You didn't know any other data. If you were told 10 years ago that this will be the monetary world, that's what you would have said we're in. And by the way, you would be right. Because the second characteristic of the world that we live in is if you add all the private savings rates, the private savings of the world, and you add the private investment of the world, you will find that the former is much bigger than the latter, even though interest rates are close to zero, and real interest rates aren't very different from that either on all the measures we have. So we have a massive surplus of private savings over investment, which is another way of saying we have a massive shortage at the world level of investment opportunities. That's what the world economy as a whole looks like. And the gap is being made up for by these fiscal deficits that everybody wants to get rid of. This is a really, really weird world. And I don't think we discuss enough about how weird it is and how the hell we're going to get out of it. Because we're getting hysterical about the possibility that the Fed will change its policies. And I should just mention in passing that the Japanese, having done this for 15 years, decided it wasn't nearly enough and decided really to start printing money. So we have what I describe as a colossally private sector savings glut world. And I think all the improvisations we're seeing, all the policies around it, are around ways of trying to fix that problem. The Chinese solved that problem temporarily by doing their own mad credit boom in the following 2008, which is exactly more or less what the Fed did, in my view, in the early 2000s. So how do we get out of this world? That seems to me the really interesting question. How do we get out of this world? Well, we certainly don't get it out of the way the Eurozone has decided to do it, because the Eurozone policies, if you go through it rigorously, are to increase this private sector savings glut. It's absolutely clear, because they want to eliminate the fiscal offsets, and they want to push the Eurozone into having a huge current account surplus, which is, again, to add to the world's savings, excessive savings over investment, so somebody else will absorb it. In the last few years, it's been the emerging countries, and they've got into a bit of trouble. This is why India's in trouble. These all things fit together. So the core problem, it seems to me, is to get the world's supply of savings and the world's opportunities for investment in line. The right way of doing this, since we live in a world with many opportunities, not in the developed world, but in the emerging world, is to change policies and institutions in such a way that global investment demand rises. And we get into a more natural world. And in that world, I think the developed world ends up as capital exporters, which is where they were in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And if we don't do that, we have to lower our savings rates. And the way we do that is run whacking great fiscal deficits, which is where the Japanese have been for 15 years, and we know where that ends up. And it is where we are now, in much of the developed world, and where I think we stay. But the main point I wanted you to take away from what I've said is this is a really strange world. And it isn't getting any less strange. We remain stuck in this with weak growth at the world level, particularly in the developed countries, with this chronic private sector savings glut situation.
Okay, yet another rather bleak perspective on the weirdness of the world economy today. Bob, are you going to offer us a fifth one?
Well, these are hard acts to follow. Like Martin, I want to thank Victor and the Foundation for the invitation, and also say that I think it's a fortuitous moment, because I think there's some opportunities for Ukraine fitting in the international economy, as you heard this morning, and maybe the discussions here can help push that in the right direction. I guess I approach this from a slightly different mental framework. I think that it's natural when you've had the big crisis we've had that this will move through phases. And part of the problem is, understandably, a lot of the analysis is always slightly backward looking. I think the challenge is to try to anticipate a little differently. And at the same time, you've got two very different trends intersecting. One is the recovery from the Great Recession, as I think Dominique first labeled it, but the other is a very big structural change with the rise of developing economies. This will not be a straight line, as they've discovered over the past months, but it is a huge potential positive trend. I mean, about 2/3 of global growth over the past 5 years have come from those countries. And if you look at the emerging middle classes in those countries, consumer opportunities, food for a country like agriculture, for like Ukraine, you've got great opportunities. But I guess where maybe my take is a little different than my colleagues here, we've clearly been through an extraordinary period of both monetary and fiscal stimulus. And your topic here about sort of austerity versus stimulus highlights that. While I don't deny there's importance with government demand policies, I think there needs to be increased attention to the structural changes, what economists call the microeconomic piece, that would lead to a handoff to the private sector. And instead, I think there's a bit of a backward-looking debate, again, about the stimulus policies, which, maybe one of the answers to Martin is sometimes these might not have worked the way that people expected, and maybe there needs to be additional components to create productivity, innovation, growth. And so these vary by economies. For some, it may be education, skills to workforce. For some, it may be infrastructure. For some, it may be the traditional trade agenda, which has fallen off to sort of add competition. So as I look over the world quickly, I see that I think Europe's major risk now is complacency. It's been stabilized somewhat by the monetary actions, but there's going to be a need for the fundamental and structural reforms. And as I look at the situation, Spain has made some improvements in terms of its competitiveness, but it's got a long way to go. Italy's stuck, and frankly, what I'm most worried about is France, which is a key player, where it will go. In the case of the U.S., it's relied on its traditional strengths of innovation, which you've seen in energy and software and business models, but it's a rather modest recovery of growth. And frankly, I think there's the weight of some government policies that have limited the willingness to really invest further. And in China, I think China needs to be given some credit for recognizing its growth model has to change. But as others here have commented, this will not be an easy switch. And so we'll see more later this year about their plans for that. And for emerging markets and developing countries in general, I think there's been a good recognition this summer, which is you have to differentiate, and they too have a structural reform agenda. They can't just rely on the flood of capital. And that actually brings you right back to Ukraine, because I think some of the issues that Ukraine is facing, either with the association agreement or other internal policies, will decide whether Ukraine will differentiate itself as one of the countries of growth opportunity, and there certainly are such, or whether it will slip back with those that don't keep up.
Okay, wow. I'm thinking now of Anna Karenina, that happy families are all alike and unhappy families are unique in their unhappiness. And I think I've had sort of 5 versions of that. So let's try to pick out some specific areas. And I'm actually going to start with Martin's focus on the sort of weird monetary world that we live in. And I would like maybe Larry first to hear from you. Do you agree with Martin's analysis, and what should, to continue the Russian literary references, что делать, what should be done about this?
Martin's right in 2 important respects. First, if you'd studied and thought a lot about economics and you'd never spent any time on planet Earth, and somebody said to you, there are 2 groups of countries. There's a group that grows relatively slowly with aging populations and existing high levels of income. And there's another group of countries that is young, converging, and with growing populations. And then you said, which way was the net flow of capital? You would think the answer was obvious. From the first group of countries with the slow growth and to the second group of countries with high growth. And that is not true in aggregate and has not been true for some years. And I think that's a central aspect of understanding the global economy. Some of it has to do with another phenomenon of life. In the 90s, we always were worried about countries with too little reserves and not enough reserves to cover potential pressures on their foreign exchange markets. Now we have large numbers of countries with reserves that seem vast relative to obvious liquidity pressures. So there's a real question about all these buildups of reserves. I think Martin is right also in emphasizing that it is odd that at a moment when, this isn't the way he put it, but it's closely related, at a moment when corporate profitability was especially high, you might think that investment opportunities were especially great, and therefore demand for funds would be especially great, and therefore interest rates would be uniquely high, not that interest rates would be unusually low. And I don't think economists fully understand this. My own pet theory is that the driving force behind a lot of this is that capital goods have become far cheaper than they used to. If you look at the price of a computer, it's 1% of what it was 25 years ago. And so the same amount of savings can accumulate vastly more capital than it ever could before. That contributes to why companies are so profitable. That pervasiveness of information technology contributes to the inequality phenomena that I described. And it means that you've got a lot of savings relative to the amount of investment opportunity simply because the investment opportunities have become cheaper. It also explains why, with direct investment opportunities more limited, just because there's only so many computers the world can absorb, more of that wealth flows into land, flows into commodities, flows into purely financial activities, and they become inflated. So I basically relate to the problems that Martin describes. I think it means that we probably are going to need larger government roles in important respects than we have before. I mean, the pet question that I ask, and versions of this question can be asked in many different places, is this. Go to Kennedy Airport. Ask yourself whether the largest, richest, most powerful country in the world should be proud to have that airport as the gateway to its capital city. Then ask yourself if a moment when the government can borrow for free for the long term in real terms, and a moment when construction unemployment is in double digits, is not the moment when that situation should be repaired. When will that moment ever be? Now, I don't think that's just an argument for big government. As Bob will point out if I don't, there's a huge role for the private sector in infrastructure finance. There's a huge role for user fees and the like, and one shouldn't think of this as just a big government activity. And it's important to understand also, and I'm speaking in an American context, but similar things are true in other places, that questions of regulation are essential. It's crucial that you regulate environmentally, that you regulate in ways that promote participation. It is also crucial that you regulate faster. Harvard has a football stadium that is 110 years old. It's right there, kind of in a central place in the city of, fairly central place in the city of Boston. It was built 110 years ago. The bulldozer had not been invented. From the time it was conceived until the time there was a football game in it was 18 months. Can anyone conceive of anything like that in the modern world, even with all the progress that we have made? So I think finding ways to support these kinds of infrastructure investments is not a matter for stimulus to get out of a temporary recession, but is a large and continuing structural challenge, whether it is airports and highways or whether it is having your cell phone work everywhere and certainly work on the road from Dulles Airport to Washington, D.C., which is not currently the situation in the United States of America. I'd put great emphasis on infrastructure as a crucial part of addressing the challenge that I've described and that Martin has described so well.
Okay, it seems that Martin is twitching to respond to that. No, you weren't looking for your microphone?
It seems to me that everything Larry said was eminently sensible. There is a question that might follow on with Bob, which I would like him addressed, particularly from his former days at the World Bank, that one of the interesting questions is whether institutional or other changes could accelerate in a useful and productive way investment demand across the entire emerging world. We've seen an amazing investment boom in China and in some other parts, but clearly this is where the unmet needs are. And it is very, very puzzling that we should be complaining about a world, and Dominique would have the same thing, we should be complaining about a world where lots of people, huge numbers of people, are clearly looking for good investment opportunities to invest in, but somehow we're not generating them.
I think that's good to hear from Bob and then Dominique about that.
Well, I think this is a point of convergence with your question and what Larry said and I said. I honestly believe if there's the right focus on what I'll loosely call structural reforms, good governance, that there are huge opportunities that could be productivity enhancing, which I think is part of Larry's logic, in both the developing and developed world. But I actually feel that some governments have actually lost sight of the very difficult steps you have to do with anti-corruption, transparency, labor and wages, bringing in the private sector to design and often maintain and operate these more effectively. So I think infrastructure would be part of it, and I would add, as in a way taking off something else that Larry said, is that there's also a human capital investment. And this goes to the questions about how we teach, the quality of the schools, the connection of the education sector with skills and jobs. These are all huge opportunities, and they're not going to be solved by a question of whether we have austerity policies or more tapering. So I'm not suggesting that those are unimportant issues. What I am suggesting is I think they've over-dominated the debate, and to get the investment opportunities that you so properly say we need, I think you need more focus on the micro and structural side with an eye towards the private sector providing that demand, as opposed to relying continually on more of the traditional spending policies by government or monetary policies. I mean, take these monetary issues. I mean, these will be issues that people will be writing PhD theses on for 20 years. I don't think we know whether this stuff is working, okay? And that doesn't mean one shouldn't have tried it. It doesn't mean that there isn't some avoidance of tail risks and downside situation. But where I started out was to say you have to keep thinking ahead. And rather than have the debate be this amount of taper or that amount of taper, I think it needs to focus on some of these other issues. And just to come back to the U.S. case, maybe Larry and I may or may not have an agreement on this. The private sector has shown a lot of innovation. The energy sector is a good example, and it has potential to transform the U.S. economy. But there are weights on that in terms of appointments, of kind of what the policies will be, carbon for various sectors, that clearly are limiting some of the potential. And in Europe, I think it's much more the case with the whole innovation agenda. There's a Luddite attitude towards technology and innovation and the changes. To make this work, you're going to have much more labor force flexibility so you can move to these sort of areas. So this is the agenda that I think needs more attention with both the developed and the developing world.
Okay, Dominique, you want to weigh in?
Well, just a word. What strikes me in this discussion is that the tone, even if we put stress on different things, is much more pessimistic, or at least less optimistic than what we can hear from politicians which are in charge of countries. And of course, politicians have to say the good words and try to create the right psychology, so we all can understand that. Nevertheless, if at the political level people do believe that things are improving by its own, they don't need to do something, then we're going directly in the wall. And the point is that when we succeeded all together 3 years ago, 4 years ago, to avoid a crisis that should have been as big as the 1929 crisis, it's because politicians were so afraid that they accept to cooperate. And what Martin saying, look at the global level, is a correct approach, but one point, which is to look at this level, you need to imagine that you can have some kind of cooperation in the world. If each player is going to play its own game and try to find domestic solution to global problem, there's no way to find a solution. So that's the right approach, providing that we're strong enough to create this kind of cooperation. And because people believe, a lot of people believe that things are going to improve by themselves, they're not pushed to this kind of cooperation. So let's frighten them and try to push them to cooperate.
Okay, well, you're doing that very successfully with me. I want to bring Andrei into the conversation. We've been talking about a glut of savings. We've been talking, Larry referred to how part of what's going on is money going into commodities and natural resources and urging money to go into infrastructure. Those would seem to be issues that would have direct relevance to the part of the world you're working in most.
I mean, I think that the growth in the emerging market and the investment in the emerging market is very limited if we continue to have the same model of development which the emerging market countries were conducting over the last years. So unless there is a structural changes, unless there is a growth of domestic consumption, I think we'll see what we see now. Actually, the investment goes back to America rather than to China or Russia or Ukraine. So I think all the emerging market countries should focus on these particular issues, and then we start to talk about the investment climate, about corporate governments, many other things which should be done. Unless it's done, there'll be no growth in investment and no growth which we all expected in 2008, as I mentioned before, when the emerging market countries would provide a further drive for the global economy. I think it's a very important issue, and I think that's what all emerging nations should think about.
Okay, that is a perfect segue into something that Larry talked about that I'd like to dwell on for a moment, which is this issue, the issue of domestic consumption and what is happening to the middle class, what is happening to the expectation that Americans, and I think, in Western industrialized countries more generally, that children would do better than their parents. Martin, how much of an issue do you see this being, and what's happening in that space?
There are, and I'm not sure what the links are, so I'd be interested in what others think. There are two things that have gone on. First, which is pretty clear across all developed countries to actually most developing countries, but not all, there's been a very large increase in income inequality on two dimensions: in the distribution of income between labor and capital, which Larry already talked about, and among labor. That has social implications, which I'm not going to go into. But it does raise a very interesting question on which there's a debate among American economists and on which I'm genuinely agnostic, because I don't think the evidence is clear. But the argument is that in order to have reasonably rapid consumption growth in an economy which has these characteristics, a lot of people have to borrow an awful lot on incomes that are uncertain and erratic, essentially, and you end up with a household credit. Household credit has been the dominant feature of the Western world's credit expansion for quite a long time, not corporate credit. Larry's pointed out that's very important. So essentially, the system has operated on the basis of wealthier people implicitly lending money to poorer people who actually are very marginal credit risks. And it's not very surprising that it takes large asset bubbles to do this, and it implodes. And then that links to the second thing, which is, so that's a model. And the second is, that also makes consumption in the countries where consumption is being strong incredibly dependent on this household credit intermediation model, which, for fairly good reasons, isn't a great credit intermediation model because it's not growth creating. It's not investment in the future, it's essentially household consumption intermediation, and we can see rather large problems with this. So the argument would be that inequality links with the credit model we've seen, and that has proved to be radically unstable in all the developed countries and some of the emerging countries that have tried it. And so now the poor developed country central banks are trying to find somewhere else to get a credit bubble going, and they're not doing very well. I think that's a very interesting view of what's going on. It's not implausible. Joe Stiglitz would certainly believe it. He's written a whole book on it. But I'm not sure it's true. Well, let's put it this. I'm sure it's partly true, but I'm not sure how far it explains the whole situation. But there is a link in any way. There is certainly an argument to be made that there is a link between the large structural forces that Larry is pointing out, which are very complex. Globalization is part of this, with the credit-fueled mess we've got ourselves into and on which we've become dependent, which I started off with. If that is the case, then our structural problems are really deep, because I don't see any of this reversing very quickly, if at all. And so you just pushed me in a really pessimistic direction. Most of the time, I think these are fixable. This is fixable. But there is an argument to be made, since you went into this issue, that this link makes our demand problems in the developed world really intractable, which means that what we really need, as I think Dominique said, is demand growth in the emerging world. And there are all sorts of reasons why that's very slow.
Okay, infrastructure is a problem not just at Kennedy Airport, but in Ukraine, and people are telling me that Bob needs to leave even before the end of the panel. He wanted to say a few words about Ukraine in the world economy, which I would love to hear. So Bob, if you would like to say a few sentences about that, and then you're going to be whisked away to your next destination.
Well, thank you, and I apologize for having to leave. I touched on this a little bit at the beginning. I just think that this conference comes at a very important time, because for many of us who've tried to follow Ukraine, the actions that the President and the Rada took a couple weeks ago signaled what might be a very significant shift in policy in terms of orientation towards the European Association Agreement and the deeper and comprehensive FTA. There are other sort of economic steps that have to be taken. But if I could put this into two contexts, the first plays off exactly what we're talking about. Ukraine is a country with huge potential in terms of human and other physical resources. And I think the question is, given these other movements in world competition, is it going to get a basic stabilization approach and then take advantage of a lot of structural opportunities with its own sort of infrastructure and creating competition? I think this EU arrangement would be a big help. It wouldn't solve all the issues. There's another key question here, and I just from my own work, which is sort of combine economics and security. And that is, this is a question ultimately not only of economics, but it's a question of the political future and the security future of Ukraine. And this doesn't suggest that Ukraine shouldn't try to have good relations with all its neighbors. I believe that's a sound and sensible policy. But I think the types of pressure that you've seen put on Ukraine recently would be such that this goes to fundamental issues of sovereignty for the future. And having been around when Ukraine achieved its second independence, I think this is a critical moment for Ukraine's future. So I just hope that while I know the political divisions are very sharp, that's a sense of a vivid democracy, and that I hope that they can use this moment to get itself on that path. And I just think that the one other aspect is that what we've talked about in terms of investment opportunities and what's happening globally, for example, I follow the agricultural markets a lot. You're going to have, this is a commodity, it's going to be a little different than minerals. You're going to have increased demand for this. You're going to have increased opportunity for processing. This is a country that could play in that global market if it makes some of the investment and sort of other changes. And that, to me, is going to be as important for the future of Ukraine as some of the political tiffs that we've seen over the past years.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bob. We will bid you farewell. Otherwise, if you miss... He's passed the mic to you, Larry. Would anyone like to just have a few more thoughts about Ukraine in this global scene we've been discussing?
There are others who can speak in a more informed way about Ukraine than I. I would only say that I think there is a challenge for countries in the middle, not unlike the challenge for people in the middle within our countries. It's clear what people at the technological cutting edge are going to do. They're going to produce the next Amazon. And it's clear what some people are going to do in the world. They're going to be assemblers for the world. But there are many who are in the middle, and their challenge is going to be finding a way forward where they may not be ready to spawn the next Bill Gates in large scale, and where they don't want to compete on price in terms of wage rates. And I think the essence of the most modern strategic thought in almost every sphere is that it is less about compensating for weakness than it is about building on strength. That it is less about being balanced than it is about achieving a distinctive excellence. And I think increasingly the places in the world that will be most successful will be the places that are able to find spheres and create clusters that are uniquely world-class in something. And being A+ at a B+ thing is going to be better than being B+ at an A+ thing. And so I'm not knowledgeable enough about Ukraine to spell out what the implications of that are, but it seems to me that for middle-income emerging countries, the challenge is increasingly going to be to focus on specialize around areas of inherited strength, whether that's a reflection of natural resources or particular historical circumstance.
Okay, Dominic, looks like you want to offer the Ukrainians more strategic
just to add
economic
a word
advice.
on what Larry says, and just to emphasize, the process, if it goes to an end, of joining the European Union will be long. So what we're talking in now is something which is going to happen in, I don't know, 10 years maybe. But the real point is the one Larry's made. What are the advantages that an economy like Ukraine may have in this set? And that's not totally obvious. It induces choices that has to be made now for the future. And joining the union is not by itself, besides structural funds and some money that you can have, which is something which is temporary and not that important, even if for some countries it has been important, but it's not structural. Then the question is, what part in the international division of labor, and especially in the European Union, a country like Ukraine can have? And the definition of the kind of clusters, of the kind of education, of the historical strength is something which is even more important than all the process of the joining, which is a more very legalistic and institutional process, certainly useful, but not really at the core of the problem from my view.
Larry wanted to jump in there.
One other, in a way, requisite of success. I think if you look across U.S. cities and states, or you look across different countries in the world, success is increasingly associated with an outward rather than an inward orientation, and with a willingness to reach out, to connect out, to try to make connections outside, rather than with a we know it all here, we do it our way is different from the rest of the world's way. And I would just say that I think this event is, and its importance and growing importance over 10 years, is a tribute to the recognition of that in Ukraine, and it's obviously a tribute to Victor's vision. And at one level, it's a nice opportunity for all of us to get together and discuss a range of global issues. But at a much deeper level, it's part of building the connections and ligatures with global society that seems to me to be essential for success in the modern world. And so I think we're all grateful for the opportunity to be here and to be part of this. And one should not lose sight of the fact that this is much more than a talk fest and an opportunity for friends to gather, but is actually part of something that is profoundly important for successful economic development. And so we're all grateful to you, Victor, for the opportunity to be part of this.
Okay. Okay, our time has run out, and that was a lovely thought, a very lovely concluding type thought. I'm just going to run through the panel one last time and ask each of you to give us your blitz thought on what's the big economic danger you see out there. Maybe you could name one that we haven't talked about, if there is one. And then what's the big opportunity? What's the really great thing? And Andrei, since you're an investor, maybe you can tell us what you're short on and what you're long on.
Well, I think the major concern, as similar to Russia, that we don't up till now see a lot of reforms in many important areas and structural reforms. So on the other hand, I think Ukraine has all the chances to be a very strong and diversified economic power with a strong agriculture, with a strong industry. So I strongly believe in the future of Ukraine. But I think one needs a little bit more political will and pressure on further reforms.
Okay, Martin, and feel free to take a global perspective on this final one.
I can't resist saying this. I suppose my major fear is that in the next 2 months, the United States is going to default.
But you have to say a positive, too. What's your big positive?
My positive is that in the next 2 months, the United States doesn't default.
Dominique.
Well, finally, I came to this panel believing that I would be the more pessimistic. I was wrong. No, my point is the one I made before. I think none of the questions we have been discussing today can find a solution at the domestic level. And because the political world is organized in countries, and sometimes in set of countries, but very fuzzy set of countries, there's very few processes that leads you to have a collective answer to this kind of problem. when you're in a crisis, as we at the climax of the crisis that we were a few years ago, this kind of cooperation takes place. But just afterwards, people goes back home and try to find his own solution. And it's not so far from what Larry says about the fact that Ukraine joining the European Union is entering or accepting to join some kind of a globalized world and not to find its own solution. All this is the same story. We are now in a globalized world, and unless we're able to put in place institutions, I'm not thinking about always about the one I had the honor to lead a few years ago, but any kind of institution that helps countries and helps politicians to work together, then the natural reaction will be to try to find domestic solution, which obviously is not a way to solve the problems.
Okay, Larry.
Let me just say that I am no rosy-eyed optimist and fan of the U.S. political process, as you can perhaps understand. But I have every confidence that we will not default. Every confidence. I think the risks are drift, disinvestment, decay, and broad disillusion is the risk. And that's what we've been describing, and an adverse cycle of all of that. I think the opportunity that we've not talked enough about here is the phenomenal liberation from drudgery associated with what technology at this moment can bring. The iPhone in my pocket has more computing power than the Apollo project, more capacity to access information than you do standing at the librarian's desk at the Library of Congress, and more ability to communicate with more people all over the planet than the White House communication system did when John Kennedy was president. And most of the people on this planet will have one 5 years from today. And that is an immense and staggering opportunity for human betterment if we can make everything else work alongside it. And that's the fundamental reason to be optimistic and to feel fortunate that we're alive at this moment.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you all for an incredibly stimulating and mind-stretching panel, and even for ending on a positive note.